What is pre and post measurement experiment all about? For you to remember the difference between this experiment and all other experiments that I've already covered on this channel, I recommend you to remember these before and after makeover schematic so that you can more easily memorize the purpose of this experiment. And the purpose of this research is to actually measure with more precision the changes in your dependent variable. In other words, measure the direction of the effect of your independent variable of your treatment on whatever that you are studying. A bit of a disclaimer, I will talk about an example of pre and post measurement experiment from one of the academic papers that I've read. I am not endorsing that particular journal or that paper. This is just something that I recently read, and I thought it would be good for you to contextualize this type of experiment and understand how it's been carried out. So the first purpose of pre and post measurement experiment is to actually assess the effect of the stimuli of the experimental intervention that you've designed to assess the change in the dependent variable occurring due to an intervention. And when we talk about the change, it could be improvement, it could be deterioration, or it could be no change. Let's have a look at an example. Let's say we have developed 2 advertisements, and we have group 1, which will be randomly allocated to advertisement 1. We also have group 2, which will be randomly allocated to advertisement 2. And we also have a control group, which does not view any advertisements, and it serves as a group for us with no intervention to establish what the effects will be like on the aspect, on the phenomena that we are researching if there is no advertisement 1 and there is no advertisement 2. So the best way for you to understand what pre and post is to remember that in these type of experiments, we are measuring dependent variable twice, at least. You can measure it multiple times in case this is your research design. That is also possible. But to make it a bit simpler, I have instances of only 2 times when the dependent variable was measured here in this example. Because we want to understand the direction of change, whether it goes up, whether it goes down, or it stays exactly the same, we naturally or logically need to measure dependent variable before they view our advertisements and after. So this is what is actually captured by dv time 1, dependent variable captured at time 1, and this is pre-exposure measurement, and this is what dv, dependent variable at time 2, stands for, because it is about us measuring the effect on the dependent variable post-exposure. Let's have a look at an example, because these type of experiments are not suitable for all cases. It usually occurs when instances when we want to see what the actual difference is in the behavior. It is very common in social marketing, policy, research interventions, and re-educational campaigns, but it's also applicable in a lot of other marketing contexts or social sciences. Here is an example. It comes from Journal of Marketing, from a paper published in 2013, where researchers were looking at the effect of different social norms on consumers' grass cycling. I've talked about this example in another video where I've actually discussed field experiments. If you're not sure what a field experiment is, please watch that video. In this paper that I'm discussing, this was one of their second studies. And what they've done, they actually wanted to see whether the intervention which they've designed, which was developed in the form of door hangers, which they left at households' doorsteps or in mailboxes, whether these interventions actually changed the behavior. The behavior, like I've already said, was grass cycling, whether people wanted to leave clipped grass from the lawn mowers on the lawn, so it actually gets naturally decomposed. Their pre-exposure measurement was actually the amount of grass which was put into the bags before households were randomly allocated to one of these 6 conditions. After some time, I believe it was several weeks after they left the leaflets at the households, they measured their dependent variable the second time. Why do we need to have a time gap? Well, because when you run field experiments, it's important that people would have enough time to process information, to have a look at their mailbox, to read door hangers, which researchers have left. So you always need to ensure you leave enough time for your participants, if you run experiments like this, to familiarize themselves with the leaflets or brochures or door hangers that you leave them. In other types of experiments where you require less time, you of course can measure your dependent variable at the second point in time a bit earlier. You just need to think carefully what is more relevant and suitable in the context of the dependent variable that you are investigating. Now, if you have watched my other recordings on this channel, you would have seen that I also have a video for between and within subjects design. And then you may be wondering, well, what is the difference between subject design, within subject design, and pre and post measurement experiment? Because they are obviously very different ways, represent very different approaches for us to conduct experiments. The difference between these three approaches is very big because all of them try to achieve a very unique goal. With between subjects design, we are trying to see what is the difference between the groups conditioned on the stimuli that we expose them to. And in the case of between subjects design, we allocate one group of participants to one experimental stimuli and another group to the other one. If we are talking about within subjects design, then it means that each of the participants will be exposed to the two treatments that we have, to two advertisements. And we are looking at the difference within one person in terms of how they process or perceive those stimuli and those advertisements. Now, when it comes to pre and post measurement design, the objective here is very different because you are actually looking at the magnitude of change in your dependent variable within the same group of people, because you are tracking them over time. And like I said before, you may be collecting your dependent variable at several points in time, depending on what actually makes sense, given the experiment that you're running and given the intervention that you are running. And journals in particular like pre and post measurement experiments because they allow us to go beyond between and within subjects design, because they allow us to quantify the actual magnitude of change in the dependent variable. And they allow us not to only quantify the magnitude of change, which is how big or how small it is, but also the direction, whether there is an increase or whether there is a decrease actually in the dependent variable that we are measuring over time. The between and within subjects design, which I have on this part of the screen, they actually show us simply whether there is a difference between group 1 that saw advertisement 1 and group 2 that saw advertisement 2, and that's it. And the mean differences could be lower or higher mean, or how far those means are from each other if we are looking at average ratings for attitudinal behavioral scales, whether there is no difference. Within subjects design, we also are measuring for exactly the same person across a larger sample of participants. Do we have substantial variations between how advertisement 1 and advertisement 2 is perceived, which is not due to chance? With the pre and post measurement design, again, we are looking at the magnitude of change and the direction of change. So let's have a look at this very interesting aspect in more detail. How is the magnitude and the direction of change is being actually captured? Like I said before, we have dependent variable captured at time 1. This is what T1 stands for. And let's say we measure it on a scale from 1 to 5. We also do the same thing at second point in time. And it's important that your measures are exactly the same, because otherwise you cannot establish the difference. That sort of makes sense. Once we collect all the data from the participants, then we would throw the data into a software statistical package to analyze it, and the software will look at the patterns. If the software on multiple numerous occasions observes that the scores at time 1 actually correspond to lower scores at time 2, that is actually a drop. If we actually experience an increase from the lower end of the scale to a larger one, that is actually a positive direction for the change in the dependent variable. And if there is nothing that is changing, we receive exactly the same measures. It was 4 at time 1 and it's also 4 at time 2, then it means no change. And I have it in yellow color here for you. And I've color coded increase with green and decrease in red color just to make it more visually appealing. So with the pre and post experiment, we not only understand the extent of difference, which is the magnitude, we can subtract 5 from 1 and we understand the magnitude is actually 4, right? And it would be much lower that it was from 2 to 4. That's the magnitude, how big something varies, but also the direction, if it goes up, down, or actually stays the same. And to establish that the trends that we are observing, the upward, downward, or no change, are statistically significant, in other words, not occurring due to chance, the software will be looking at multiple observations. It means that you need to have a large sample in your experimental conditions to actually establish that the variations that we are observing in data, they are statistically significant and that there is a trend in there. The no change actually is a very interesting concept. Statistically, it means that there are no data variations, and the results are not different between time 1 and time 2. Very often, researchers are not very happy about it, and journals may be rejecting papers. However, I encourage you to think about the purpose of your research and what is it that you're exactly measuring. If you are looking at particular policy intervention, re-education of consumers for social marketing campaigns, and you already got a group of people who already engage in this behavior, and you're developing a campaign to target those who are not engaged in the behavior, you want to ensure that those who already are on the market, already purchasing your product, or already engaged in behavior are not put off and are not discouraged by your intervention. So in this case, the no change between time 1 and time 2 for these people is actually what you're looking for, because the people who are actually after are the people who are not engaged in this behavior. And for them, you want to see either an upward or downward trend depending on your hypothesis, if you are trying to encourage the behavior or you want to reduce negative behaviors in consumers. The second purpose of pre and post measurement experiments is to actually rule out alternative explanations. The alternative explanations could refer to something else which is responsible to changes in your dependent variable at time 2, which is not explained by your experimental intervention. Very often, researchers conceive beliefs and attitudes as something that may actually impact on how your dependent variable changes over time when you run an experiment. In the pre and post measurement experiments, ultimately, as a researcher, what you would like is to actually demonstrate that one of those interventions that you've designed is responsible for a particular change in the behavior. Let's have a look at an example. This example comes from a work done by Green and Brock, and it was published in 2000. They had several sets of interventions where the first one was a narrative transportation into a violent, unjust world story, and the second manipulation was a control group. And they wanted to see whether their narrative transportation into the story would affect the beliefs about violence and unjust world. And what they've done, they hypothesized that perhaps the changes or variations in the belief that they observe at time 2 may be to some extent explained by the beliefs about violence and unjust world at time 1. And to rule this out and to actually establish with certainty it was your manipulation that resulted in variations and changes in beliefs, they've collected data about the beliefs about violence and unjust world before they exposed people to their own interventions. And what they've done to rule out the effect of beliefs at time 1 on beliefs at time 2, they regress the beliefs from time 1 onto beliefs at time 2. And for you to rule this out, this effect should not be statistically significant. There should be no relationship between beliefs at time 1 and beliefs at time 2. But what really should be statistically significant is actually experimental interventions, the manipulation. Some of them should be related to the beliefs. So pre and post measures in this case allow you to rule out an alternative explanation. And as you can see here, they've collected data with 9 weeks in between the first and the second time collection. That is really good because it allows us to minimize the effects of consumers or participants becoming aware of the purpose of research. I hope the difference between pre and post measurement experiment is very clear to you, and now you know when it should or should not be used.